And start recording. Hello and welcome to our NRCS info session. We're going to talk about Conservation Stewardship Program for farmers and ranchers. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Carly Boyer, OrCAN's program manager. This event was brought to you by Oregon Climate and Agriculture Network, Natural Resource Conservation Service, OSU Extension, with funding from Western Sustainable Agriculture Researcher Education Oregon, Western SARE Professional Development Program. We are happy to welcome Will Fett, an NRCS Outreach Coordinator and Tribal Liaison, and Lynn Larson, NRCS District Conservationist, to talk about the Conservation Stewardship Program. Please save your questions until the Q&A at the end of the hour. We expect to wrap up by 3 p.m. And with that, I'll pass it over to Will Fett to share about the program. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. As Carly said, my name is Will Fett, and I work out of the NRCS state office in Portland, but am very happy to be with you today to talk about our NRCS programs, specifically the Conservation Stewardship Program, and how you as a producer might be able to take advantage of that. As a little bit of an overview of the Natural Resources Conservation Service, we provide technical assistance and financial assistance to producers, primarily working with private landowners, but then also working with tribal entities. And that technical assistance is really what is at the heart of what we do, because we want to have good technical standards and science-based implementation of conservation practices to really promote the economic, but then also the environmental and social aspects of your production operation. Now, we know that once a conservation resource is identified and might need to be addressed, that there might be some financial assistance that's required to help implement that. And so that's the second piece of the programs that are offered by NRCS is financial assistance through contracts that will help you implement good conservation on your property. Everything that we do is 100% voluntary. We are not a regulatory agency. So if you are interested in implementing conservation practices, that is a choice, but we will be there to step alongside you and help make that happen. If you look at the different buckets of and types of programs that are offered by NRCS, there are three main categories, kind of a long-term, an intermediate term, and then a short-term option. Our long-term programs would be our conservation easement programs, and those are really focused on either wetlands or working agricultural lands. We're not necessarily looking at taking land out of production, but instead looking at protecting that land and ensuring that it is good for agricultural production and good for good management for the sustainable environment. Those can be long-range plans, so we're thinking in the 30-year time frame, but a mid-tier range plan would be what we're going to focus on today, and that's the Conservation Stewardship Program. Typically a 5-year contract, so if you're already doing conservation practices, this is a good way of stepping it up a little bit more, ensuring that you're being recognized for the good conservation work that you're doing, and then maybe increasing what you're already doing and just doing that little bit of extra. If you've never worked with us before, a good place to get your foot in the door is with the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. And those are typically 1 to 3 year contracts focusing on either one or more, a suite of resource concerns. And that could be plant productivity, it could be soil erosion, it could be livestock grazing issues and water access issues. There's really a whole suite of conservation practices that can be applied. And those suite of conservation practices can be applied across all three of these programs. So when we're talking about there's individual conservation practices, but then there's also these programs that are a little bit more time focused. The steps for getting involved is having an initial conversation with an NRCS district conservationist or a conservation planner in your local area. We have service centers that are in almost every single county across the US. Here in Oregon, that means that you do have a local service center that will be willing to walk your property and talk about your conservation goals as part of that planning process. Once you've kind of had that conversation and have an idea of what's possible, then we usually move to application. And it's a relatively simple application. I'm going to walk through that before the end of today's session so that you can get a sense of what's required. It's the eligibility that becomes a little bit more complicated and some additional forms that might need to be filled out. But what my big advice to producers is don't eliminate yourself from consideration. If you have a conservation interest, please fill out that application and start that conversation with us, because it'll be a good way to discover, if you're not immediately eligible, what things you might need to tweak or accomplish to become eligible. Once you have that application, unfortunately, there's not unlimited funding, so your application is matched in funding pools of similar applications, and then the best applications that score the highest are going to be the funded applications. For things like the Conservation Stewardship Program, we are funding almost all of them. I'm not going to say that we fund them all, because that's a catch-22 that I don't want to commit to. But because of significant funding from the Inflation Reduction Act, that it does allow us to fund a vast majority of those applications. And so if it is a good application that meets all of our eligibility requirements, there is a really good chance that you can enter into a contract with us for these voluntary conservation practices. And then we're with you through that planning discussion. We're with you through that application discussion. But most importantly, we're going to be right there with you through implementation of that conservation practice, or those suite of conservation practices. So again, providing that technical assistance throughout the process. Application is one of those first steps, as I mentioned, and you would work with a district conservationist. So it's important that you find your local USDA service center and connect with your district conservationist. Emmerich has put the link to that local USDA service center in the chat, so please do check that out. Once you have had that initial planning conversation and identify what your goals are and what conservation practices you want to address on your operation, then you just need to make sure and get it submitted before the deadline. For the purpose of EQIP, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, those applications are typically due in November. And then a program that you can take advantage of now is the Conservation Stewardship Program, and those applications are typically due in March. This year, March 29th. Circle that day on your calendar, and please make sure that if you're at all interested, that you get an application into us before March 29th. If you aren't sure about it for this year, but want to stay up to date on dates for next year, do sign up for our Gov Delivery email listserv, and that will ensure that whenever those dates are announced, that you are first to know about it, and that you can ensure to get an application in. Now, once you have the application in, we do move on to eligibility requirements. And this might seem daunting at first, but I think you'll find it's just a little bit of paperwork to help ensure that the project that you want is that meets all of our requirements. And you would need to have a customer data worksheet with the Farm Service Agency. if you don't already have a farm and tract number on your property, that might be a step that you need to do. But if you've been involved in production and if you've ever worked with us before, you probably have some of this basic information, and it might just be an issue where we need to update your records. If you are leasing property and still want to do conservation, we do need a couple of other documents like that lease agreement or concurrence with the landowner. So we just want to make sure that if you don't own the property outright, at least the property owner does give their thumbs up and stamp of approval that you can move forward with conservation on that land. These programs are for those farmers who have an adjusted gross income of less than 900,000. That's a pretty high threshold that I would assume a lot of producers are able to meet. The idea there is that these programs, if the farm has an adjusted gross income of more than 900,000, that they have the financial capabilities of implementing conservation practices on their own and don't necessarily need to take advantage of these programs. We always want to make sure that the land is in compliance with the highly erodible land conservation and wetland conservation. So we do some background checks to make sure that it is in compliance and that we're not adversely affecting the property. If there is any concern there, we need to have a plan to fix and correct those concerns before we can move forward with a project. As I mentioned, you might need to establish a farm and tract number. There are special considerations for socially disadvantaged, limited resource farmers, beginning farmers, those that have military experience. So if that applies to you, please do call attention to that in the application process so that we can ensure that you get all of the benefits that you're eligible for. And then because this is financial assistance and there would be a payment or reimbursement involved in it, we do everything electronically and would need a direct deposit 1199 as part of that process and ensuring that that when obligated that you can receive payment. I mentioned that there are some benefits to historically underserved producers. Specifically, those are higher payment rates. Those are eligibility for advanced payment. Up to 50% of an EQIP project can qualify for advanced payments. And then also priority for funding. So when your application is grouped into a funding pool or a ranking pool, it's ranked with similar applications. Beginning farmers receive additional points in that ranking process, and socially disadvantaged producers receive their own funding pool. So please do call attention to that. Beginning farmers are anyone who has 10 years experience or less. And so that does apply to a fair number of producers who are currently engaged in growing our food and fiber. In addition to your eligibility as an individual, there are some land eligibility requirements. Most of these are easy enough to achieve. The land must be producing, so it can't be fallow, untouched land. It needs to be producing a product. That could be a crop, that could be livestock, or it could be a timber crop. As I mentioned, these are private lands or tribal lands. There are some instances where we can work on public lands, but that's if the private agricultural producer might have a lease agreement on a public land or a similar scenario. Those again, leased land is important to know that you can apply our conservation practices on those. You just need the landowner concurrence with that and a copy of the lease agreement to ensure eligibility. The third consideration for eligibility, so we have you as an individual or as a business entity, we have the land, and then the third one is a resource concern eligibility. In a lot of cases, the resource concerns are specific to your area or even specific to your property. Because if you look across Oregon, there is a lot of diversity in the way that we do agriculture. On the west side of the state, where it's more mountainous, timber, higher rainfall, the types of agriculture and therefore the types of resource concerns are considerably different than the eastern half of the state, where water conservation might be an issue, sagebrush management might be an issue, sage grouse as a wildlife species might be an issue. So the resource concerns that we're focusing on are very geographically determined, and therefore the priorities set in that local area are determined by a local work group. We really try to take a strategic approach to implementing conservation. And so there are specific resource concerns that we can address in different geographies. All that said, there is a much higher focus on climate smart mitigation activities, which means that there are a suite of conservation practices that are available anywhere across the state of Oregon if they are climate smart. So it's important to understand that there might be some local limitations, but ask questions and consider expanding your thought process of the goals that you want to achieve, because the resource concern might be a climate smart mitigation activity that it might be eligible for, even if it's not a local resource concern. So the Conservation Stewardship Program, the meat and potatoes of what we hope to talk about today, is a program that has 3 different payment scenarios. The most common is the third bullet point at the bottom there, minimum contract payments of $4,000 per year for 5-year period. So this is maybe the simplest option. Maybe this is the one that would be most applicable to you, but then there are other alternatives like annual contract payments and supplemental payments. So at the beginning, I kind of described Conservation Stewardship Program as this: you're already doing good conservation and you want to step it up a notch. The annual contract payments and the supplemental contract payments allow for you to implement additional conservation practices. So you might already be doing good conservation and then want to step it up a notch. We're going to help pay for those additional practices. So there's a lot of opportunity here. And again, it's really important to talk about what your goals are and make sure that the district conservationist that you're working with understands what you hope to achieve, so that they can get you the right application with the right contract and the right payment type. There's a couple of different examples that I can talk about generally with the Conservation Stewardship Program. First of all, if you're just thinking about how do you manage cover crops and do timely planting of those, cover crops might have to be flown on before the cash crop is harvested. Cover crops might be planted after November 1st or even into the spring of the year. How do you think about that timing and harvest the cash crop and then still get the cover crop on before the growing season ends? Really creating a plan that you can implement over a number of years might be an important piece of your production operation. Grazing plans are another good way to utilize the Conservation Stewardship Program, because here you're thinking about improving the quality of forage that would ultimately improve the livestock's production capabilities, and you're doing that through managing good grazing. Finally, another example would be no-till and managing erosion or managing a forested area. All of those things can take multiple years to really get a good system built. And so this is a good way of utilizing the Conservation Stewardship Program. I mentioned the climate smart mitigation activities. There are literally dozens and dozens of different conservation practices that can be a part of this. So again, please have that conversation through the planning project or process to really key in on what makes the most sense for your individual production operation. Whether it be livestock production, grazing, or crop management, or forestry, there's probably something that we can offer that would fit and meet your individual needs. I mentioned ranking, so I want to briefly touch on that and know that there are those funding pools. So if you're a specialty crop producer and need a high tunnel, we have an individual funding pool for high tunnels here in the state. Beginning farmers, socially disadvantaged, forest land, cropland, these are all how we are bucketing those applications together so that your application is being ranked against similar applications. But those localized ones are there in the right-hand column, thinking about food security or wildfire hazard mitigation or sage grouse protection. Those are very geographically specific, and so those are developed from those local work groups. Again, there's considerations with historically underserved producers and how your application might rank higher. When you address multiple vulnerabilities on your operation, that can rank your application higher. When you address multiple conservation practices, that can rank your application higher. So these aren't must-haves, but they're good things to think about throughout the process. When you are signed on to a contract with us and obligated, the implementation can happen throughout the growing season. The cost share of EQIP, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, might be 70 to as much as 90% of the cost of that practice. Every single practice has a slightly different payments scenario. So those percentages are very ballpark, but you're looking at a good chunk of the cost being covered by NRCS, and then you as the producer would be responsible for the remaining amount. With the Conservation Stewardship Program, especially with the minimum payment scenario, it's just a flat $4,000. It's not a cost share. We're not looking for a certain amount for you to cover. In the instance of the minimum payment scenario, it's just a flat $4,000. And it's important to note that that went up just this last year because previously it was only $1,500. So $4,000 now really makes it hopefully incentivizing to you as a producer to take advantage of this program. So I'm going to stop there and stop my screen share. And I've got a couple more examples, but I want to turn it over to my colleague, Lynn, who is a district conservationist and has some good examples of Conservation Stewardship Program and how he has been able to work with customers. So Lynn, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Will. I wanted to just reiterate a couple of things and perhaps share some insight for those of you that may be wanting to get into this program. First of all, and I share this with clients all the time that walk in our door, you have no obligation by completing an application. That just gets the process started. Will is 100% correct. Fill out an application. That really is a marker for us to go ahead and get started with the process to move towards a contract. Specifically, what we're talking about today would be for the Conservation Stewardship Program. If you go to our webpage, there is a link to a product called Is CSP Right for Me? It goes through a whole bunch of different items talking about whether or not it might be a good fit. I wish they would put on there something along the lines of, I am willing to keep good records and share those with NRCS at the end of the growing season. Really, for you to be successful in the Conservation Stewardship Program, you do need to be willing to keep good records of the enhancements, the practices that you're completing, so that when we do get to the end of the year, we can go ahead and make payment without any issues. We don't like to get to the end of the year and then have problems. That's not good for any of us. I'll put, if we don't get it in there before, I will put in the chat a link to all of the different enhancements that are available for you to select from if you're interested in getting into the Conservation Stewardship Program. There are dozens of different enhancements. In most cases, when we are working with someone here in our area in Eastern Oregon, far less than half of those enhancements are even applicable to the operations here in this area, whether they be small farms, medium farms, large farms, ranches. So if you are working on getting an application in with NRCS and working with District Conservationist in my office or other offices throughout the county or country, work with them closely on what enhancements do work well in this area. And if you have questions on specific enhancements that they don't bring up, certainly have that conversation with them. Having those conversations early on really lead to a good, solid contract in the end. That's critical for you and the staff at the NRCS office to have that conversation about those specific enhancements. Most of all, they are going to share with you what will you be required to do. So I think we'll get into that a little bit more later, but and if not, we'll come back to that. So some specific examples on contracts that we have worked with here in my area in Eastern Oregon. We've worked with farmers on irrigated land, and they've done enhancements such as cover crop, residue and tillage management, irrigation water management, forage harvest management, those types of enhancements. Most of those are pretty straightforward, but again, they do take record keeping on the participants' part to be successful in the end. Other contracts that we've worked with are on rangeland, and those have addressed issues such as livestock production and also wildlife habitat. So they might be grazing management, enhancements that address livestock health and quality, other enhancements that address wildlife habitat. Specifically here in Eastern Oregon, we've had several enhancements that address sage-grouse habitat that Will mentioned. I would make mention that the Conservation Stewardship Program contracts are 5-year contracts. Typically in the first year, and then again, it depends on timing in many cases. First year might be fairly light in what you are required to do. But by year 2 and 3, you will be implementing any and all of the enhancements that are in your contract. Some enhancements are a single one line item, one time in 1 year. Other enhancements are management type enhancements that can and must be done each year of the contract. So they really vary on what's required. and how often you're required to produce records on those enhancements or practices that you're implementing. As you're working with NRCS staff, you might ask, well, how many enhancements or practices should I have in my contract? And that is a great question, and one that we really try to guide our participants through as we move from application to contract. You could have a dozen or more enhancements in a contract. However, that may or may not be the best way to go about this program, and it may not even be reasonable for the payment that you're going to receive in the end. So we try to work with the contract participants to get a balance between what they're going to be required to do and then the payment that they might receive in the end. We try to maximize the payment received through this program with the number of enhancements that you might include in your contract. Typical for contracts here in our area are 3 to 5 enhancements in a contract. Is that going to be the case in all areas? It may not be. Again, work with your local office on how many and which enhancements you should pursue towards a contract. I would also say that prior to getting a contract and signing that contract, it really is an iterative process somewhat. Your conservationist might have a half dozen or so enhancements or practices that they would suggest based on their local knowledge and knowledge of your operation. You might come to the table with 3 or 4 or a dozen enhancements that you've looked at on the NRCS website. And so it would be a back and forth with the conservationist at that point to talk about what would be the benefits and what's going to be required for those specific enhancements or practices. So that's what it is. That's what I mean by an iterative process, that back and forth in that conversation as you're moving from application to contract. Like Will mentioned, in order for you to qualify for the CSP program, you have to select enough enhancements and have enough acres and so forth to meet that minimum $4,000 threshold. If you have enough acres and enough enhancements and the right enhancements, you could hit the maximum of $200,000 in your contract over that 5-year term. If you do hit that $200,000 maximum, the conversation that we have with our participants is, how can we spread out that $200,000 payment so that it best meets your needs and is reasonable? So, for instance, in many cases, if we have a participant that reaches that maximum dollar value, we'll spread that out evenly of $40,000 per year over the 5 years. So that's a typical scenario for our office. It might vary in different offices. Again, we've worked with very small farms, new and beginning farmers, medium-aged farmers and ranchers, some with gray hair, all across their spectrum. So when you're looking at CSP, is it right for me? Yeah, have that conversation with your local office. And then I guess I would just end with, once again, you will be required to do certain things, and they will, you'll have to produce documentation that you completed those practices or enhancements according to the specifications in the contract. And that is typically at the end of the growing season in the fall. And payments are usually completed at the end of the calendar year, typically in November and December. And we can make payments over into the new calendar year as well for the previous year's work. Okay, I probably generated a lot of questions. I'll kick it back to Will. He can guide us through application and perhaps some more specifics on some enhancements, and then we'll answer some questions at the end.
Thanks so much for that, Lynn. I think it really helps get a framework around that. I mentioned the minimum payment, but yes, it's important to know the scope, that there is a maximum of 200,000 on this. So we can very easily address large projects. We can easily address small projects. I imagine you're wondering to yourself, okay, what does this look like? How can I go about submitting an application? And I'm happy to tell you that for the purpose of March 29th, the deadline of submitting an application, all you need to do is fill out a 2-page application. I would recommend having that conversation with the district conservationist prior to November 29th, but having the paperwork turned in, March 29th, having that paperwork submitted by March 29th is really kind of the key to kicking off this whole process. We just need some basic information: your name, the organization's name if you are an incorporated farm production operation, where the work will be done. So if you have a business address that's separate from a physical address of the farm, and then the type of assistance required. So hopefully you'll go into this process with an idea of whether or not you want to apply for the EQIP program or the CSP program, and you can indicate that on this form. The beauty is that we have one application for both programs, and really one application for 5 different programs that we offer. So if the Conservation Stewardship Program isn't right for you, maybe the Environmental Quality Incentives Program is right for you. And so you have the opportunity of kind of submitting one application and being considered for both. We need to know your legal name. We need to know if you're applying as an individual or as an entity. And sometimes a business might be a family business with multiple people involved, your spouse, your kids, your parents. And it's important to understand that this is a kind of a business application. If you're a sole proprietor, then it only needs to be you, but if it involves multiple people, we need to have all of those folks involved in the conversation. We also want to know if you meet any of those categories where additional benefits may apply. So limited resource, beginning farmer, socially disadvantaged, or veteran. We want to be able to track that from the beginning of the application. And then what kind of land, who controls it, if it's under a lease agreement or if you have a deed to the property. If the program is or if the land is enrolled in any other conservation programs, or and then what kind of crops or livestock you raise. So it's a pretty simple, straightforward application, only 2 pages. I think where people maybe get a little daunted in is the later steps of eligibility. But again, we are there to walk you through those and help you to ensure that all your questions get answered and that nothing is left outstanding. So this application can be found online. I believe the link will be dropped in the chat. And then the other thing that I want to do is provide paint a little bit of a picture of what these individual practices might look like. So hopefully my sound will work. And I'm going to share herbaceous weed treatment as one example This is not something that needs to be applied across the board, but is one example of a conservation practice that could be implemented. Carly and Emmerich, let me know if sound or video isn't working.
Today we're looking at herbaceous weed treatment. This practice is used to suppress undesirable plant species so we can promote the more desirable species such as native grass and wildflower plantings, tree plantings, or even in some situations, pasture management practices. The GAMs are very passionate about conservation. They have management plans on a lot of their property for the tree practices as well as native grasses and wildflowers.
For me, conservation is just the beauty of the outdoors, the wildlife, the birds, but also in the long run, it's about leaving a legacy for children, grandchildren, as you decide to plant trees or flowers or forbs. There's one thing that'll happen for sure, you're gonna have invasive weeds. On this farm, we use mowing and chemical control. These help control the weeds in the bigger fields.
Benefits of the herbaceous weed treatment practice, a lot of times we're bringing in seed or small saplings of trees. So by suppressing the undesirable species, we're promoting the more favorable ones so they can get established.
Working with the NRCS, they have different programs. You can get some financial help that helps you buy the equipment and things that are needed to take care of the weeds that are invading what you're really trying to do.
Great. So that was one example of a conservation practice that is available. And then I want to just run through real quickly another a couple examples so that you get an idea of the range, and especially things that are common to Oregon. Nutrient management is another example. And so that's going to focus on improving the soil, reducing salinity, improving water quality. We can also look at things like forage harvest management. So optimizing the quality and quantity of forage, managing desired species, reducing soil nutrient loss. These are all going to be pieces of forage harvest management. And then things like prescribed grazing, looking at increasing forage health, increasing herd health, decreasing your feed costs, all of those different pieces of the puzzle for managing prescribed grazing, a grazing management system. So just a couple of examples to hopefully give you an idea of the possibilities, but know that this is just scratching the surface of what is available. And with that, I think we're going to open it up for some questions. So I'll start with the one that I can see in the chat, and then Carly and Emmerich can help me navigate. What's the minimum acreage requirement? First of all, to note that to work with NRCS, there is no minimum acreage requirement. You might have heard that the National Ag Statistics Service says that a farm is anything that $1,000 of income or more. For us, that does not apply. So if you have a half acre, if you have a 10 by 20 raised bed in your backyard, that could be eligible. It really comes down to, is the land eligible, and is there a resource concern that you are trying to address? So there is no minimum. We work with small producers, we work with large producers. With a small producer, the thing to understand is that a lot of our tools and systems are built per acre. And we are working hard to try and scale those down to talk about per foot for a cover crop seeding calculation. Needs to, in a small scale scenario, might need to be per foot versus per acre. We are working on scaling all of our tools down to that level. We haven't done it across the board, but we're working hard and can work with small scale producers.
I would just mention, if you have a question on, I'm a small acreage farmer, is this program, the Conservation Stewardship Program, going to be reasonable for me to work in because of my small acreage? Contact your local office and they can step you through what you can do, and potentially what that payment might look like. Because if you're going to only receive $4,000, but it's going to take you $10,000 worth of work, that may not be reasonable.
Great, thank you, Will and Lynn. Maud has a question, two-part question clarification. She asked, do we need to fill out the AD-1026 first? That's what the website says.
So my answer to that is that a lot of these steps can kind of happen concurrently. And we work very closely with our sister agency, the Farm Service Agency, and they're going to be the one who holds your farm record. And we are the one who is going to be working on conservation implementation. Ultimately, your contract would be with us as NRCS, but we share data with the Farm Service Agency. So if you've never worked with us before, it is a good idea to get your farm record established with the Farm Service Agency as a first step, or at very least as a concurrent step with your conservation application. It's not 100% required that it has to be step one, step two, but it does help the flow of information if at very least those are concurrent steps.
Great. She also asks to clarify, the website also says the first step is to make a plan and contact your local conservation planner before submitting. Is that correct?
And my same answer there is the steps can kind of happen concurrently. I would recommend that you have that conversation with the district conservationist first, because they can help guide you with that application. On the application, it asks what kind of assistance are you requesting. If you just say, I'm looking for help with my production operation, that doesn't give us a whole lot to go on. But if you say, I'm looking for help to mitigate soil erosion in my cow-calf herd operation, that allows us to clue in a little bit faster and understand what kind of help you're requesting, whether or not you would be better suited for EQIP or CSP. So it doesn't have to be a step one, step two, step three, but it does help with the flow of information if you've had that conversation first.
Great, thank you. We now have 4 more questions in the chat, so try to run through those. Janelle asks, is there any restriction on where the farms are, and what types of practices could urban farmers use to access the Inflation Reduction Act funds?
It's a great question, and we are definitely trying to work more with urban farmers, and that kind of falls into our small scale urban, the scenarios that I was describing, where we're trying to calculate on a square foot basis. The answer is yes, we can work with any producer anywhere. It has to be private lands and meet our land eligibility requirements, but other than those eligibility things that I kind of went over quickly, those would be the only restrictions. There's not a geographic area that we block out, for example. It really comes down to the individual piece of property.
Great. Shana asks, what if this is our first year producing, no farm records yet? Can we still be eligible?
Please, by all means, submit an application. You might have heard of a 3-year of production record requirement, and that is true of Farm Service Agency loans specifically. So for NRCS conservation practices, we want to see production records, because again, that helps us better diagnose the issues that might be present, or work with you a little bit better, understand your goals, but that is not a requirement.
Great, thank you. Charles asks, does a family farm group ownership with only one veteran get an extra benefit?
So the veteran one is a little bit tricky because the definition that is in the current farm bill says it's a military veteran who is within 10 years of leaving service. So basically, try and think about it as like a beginning farmer military veteran is who the benefit applies to. Those benefits do have to apply to all individuals of the entity if it is an entity that is applying. So based on the way the question was asked, I'm probably going to answer no, but still have that conversation so that you can determine the exact requirements and if there might be a fit there.
Great. Okay, RJ asked, are any examples of small grape vineyards in the program?
Lynn, I'm not sure if you have any grapes in your area, but I can't think of an example specifically. I can talk more broadly.
Sure, we do not have any small grape vineyards here in our area in Malheur County that we've worked with. However, that doesn't mean that we don't work with those types of operations.
Yeah, with vineyards specifically, a lot of times what the conservation practice that we're doing is things like contour planting, like putting the vines along the contour of a sloped area so that we're mitigating erosion. Or you might look at windbreaks to protect the grape vineyard. You might look at water management so that you're potentially irrigating the vineyards. So there's still conservation practices that can be applied to a vineyard. It just is, it's very situationally dependent.
Great, we're getting all kinds of questions in the chat. It's really popping off. I'll try and keep up with them so we can get them all answered. Clayton asks, if the land of concern is on a reservation, does NRCS require a tribal resolution to complete a conservation plan?
Great question. So it it depends. If it is on the reservation and it is part of an allotment, it is usually, we have to get BIA involved. If it is part of the reservation that is tribally owned, the contract is usually directly with the tribe rather than the individual producer. So there's a lot of ways that we can make it happen. It's situationally dependent, and I hate saying that, but because I'd love to give you some more specifics, but please bring it to us. We'd love to consider it.
Great. Shayna asks, self-funded, but our whole focus is regenerative practices, and we'd rather have this kind of guidance, assistance from the beginning. Thank you.
And technical assistance is at the core of what we do. You are under no obligation to take financial assistance from us. And if you just want a second set of eyes, invite us out. We'd love to have that. We'd love to offer technical assistance and be there with you.
Absolutely. That's one of my most favorite things that I get to do is to go and visit with farmers and ranchers out in the field, talk about their operations and find out what new and interesting things that they are doing so that I can share that with other folks as well. So yeah, invite us out regardless. Thank you.
Great. So I have one from Diane. I really appreciate this, and I'm still unclear as to what exactly needs to be completed before the deadline. My experience is that local agents aren't terribly available, so having that first meeting isn't feasible. The AD 1026 form asks for information I don't have or fully understand.
I appreciate the question, Diane. Understand that yes, we are short-staffed like a lot of folks, and it might take us a little bit to get back to you, but the district conservationist doesn't have to be the end-all be-all, especially if you just have some simple questions. please reach out to me. I think Carly is going to share my contact information, and if I don't know the answer, I will find out the answer. So so please let us know how we can help. The 80-10-26, again, that's a farm service agency. The absolute best way to do it is walk into that local service center, because they should have somebody available there to hand you a hard copy, can answer your questions in person. If you are more want to do it online and have those questions, you can call up the office, or again, contact me, and I can put you in touch with somebody else from Farm Service Agency. We don't want you to be left out there hanging, and I know that is sometimes the experience because we are short-staffed and have staff turnover, but know that you have hopefully other routes to get your questions answered.
I'd just make a quick comment on this as well. Thanks for that. So the only thing that's required before the deadline is the application that Will went through. If you want to make sure that you meet with someone at the at your local NRCS office, because oftentimes we are in the field and we're not in the office all the time. Call ahead. That's what I ask many of our clients to do. If they want to meet with someone specifically here in the office, call ahead, make sure someone's going to be here to meet you. I'd suggest that. If you can't get a hold of someone, again, contact Will, contact me. You have our information. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a few more, and I don't think we're going to have time for everything, unfortunately. There was personal experience about timelines, and so a good reminder to give yourself enough time as possible to talk with both the NRCS office and FSA. Right now, there's about 6 weeks lead time, so if you're interested, make a move as soon as possible. And Diane brings up again the website that pops up when searching for NRCS CSP has a list of 5 steps with no links to the forms, and don't see the friendly simple form that was shown in the presentation. So the links that we have shared so far are all going to be shared in a follow-up resource email that everybody who registered for today will receive. So we're trying to include all of the best and all of the essential resources, so you should have those.
Mm-hmm.
And
the only thing I would say there, Diane, is different search engines have different algorithms, and when you put in those keywords, I can't guarantee which NRCS website it pops up. But if you have any questions, if you can't find what you're looking for, please reach out.
And the last question here is, can you search your farm's conservation record if you have an FSA number, or more specifically, contracts with FSA NRCS? I'm a younger farmer inheriting a farm that has been managed for 40+ years. It can be, oh, it just, there it went. It can be confusing about what program we've already participated in.
Mm-hmm.
Any short answers on that?
Short answers is, if you go to farmers.gov, you can log in with a producer account. There's some steps that you have to do to set up your producer account, but it becomes a place that you can, a portal that you can access your farm records that are with Farm Service Agency or NRCS, and maybe see what has been done in the past. It does require an account setup, but it is available. So the answer is yes, with a great big asterisk caveat.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to go into our closing. Thank you again to Will Fett and to Lynn Larson for their presentations today. A lot of great answers. Please keep an eye out for the follow-up email. Like I mentioned, they'll have next steps, their contact, and all of the links. We will also have this recording available for view if you need to reflect back on anything that was shared today. That'll be on our YouTube, and the link will be in the follow-up email. Thank you for attending today, and have a great afternoon. Thanks so much for joining us. Thank you again.